Hello, everyone, and welcome to Asset Management Awareness Month. My name is Kim Fager, and I'm the VP of Communications and Marketing. Today is our second webinar in our Awareness Month series. And before we get started and I introduce today's speaker, I'd like to run through some logistics. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our NPMA website and YouTube channel later this month. If you're an active NPMA member logged in and listening today, you will automatically get CEU credit. And then lastly, if you have questions during the presentation, please write them in the question box and we'll review them as we go along. Now I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Doug Goetz. Since 1979, Doug has been working as a property administrator. He's been a full professor at two universities, the Air Force Institute of Technology and the Defense Acquisition University. Doug has taught hundreds of classes for both the government and NPMA. He's an editor for the NPMA Property Professional and the Journal of Property and Asset Management. He's written hundreds of articles for multiple publications and has been awarded lots of awards that hang on his wall. Doug has been married for 44 years, and even better, it has been to the same woman. He has a great family and grandkids, deep religious convictions, and is always interested in learning. Doug, welcome to today's webinar, and thank you for joining us.
Superb. Thank you, Kim. I greatly appreciate the opportunity. Really cool that we can do this. You know, the technology is just so amazing that we have people all over the country, all over the world, and we can share that same information. So, you know, when Kim approached me to do a webinar part of Asset Management Awareness Month, I was trying to think of topics, and yeah, we could go into some real technical, detailed topics that have such fine points and analysis. But in my work over the past year or couple of years, I've noticed that there's a real need to look at some of the fundamental requirements of managing government property in the possession of contractors. So there's the wonderful story about Vince Lombardi. For some of you younger people, you may not know that name, but let me give you some background to that. So this is going to be talking about back to basics, the fundamentals of government contract property management, but looking at the construct from a Vince Lombardi standpoint. So we have to wonder, well, who is Vince Lombardi? Well, a very famous football coach, no doubt about it, Green Bay Packers, and every training camp he started, he would bring out this pigskin, per se, and introduce it. Gentlemen, this is a football. Well, you may say, wait a minute, Doug, we're not that basic. But unless you understand the fundamentals, you might have some problems. So what I've done here is here's your topical outline. What is government property provided under a contract? But if we're going to talk about what is government property, I also have to talk about what is not government property under a contract. I'd like to look at the contractual requirements for providing government property, the contractual requirements for managing government property, government responsibilities for oversight, contractor liability for government property, and then contractor disposition or disposal of government property. So a broad overview of the things we do in regard to government property and the possession of contractors from two perspectives. I'm going to look a little bit as to what the government does, a little bit as to what industry does, right? So context. You really need to emphasize what the focus of this presentation, because others within Asset Management Awareness Month will be covering other topics, but my topic is in regard to government property in the possession of contractors. I'm not going to focus on government property in the possession of government entities under grants and cooperative agreements. There is some overlap there, but that's not the primary focus of this. I know that Yvonne Batcher, one of our leaders within the field of NPMA, will be doing a workshop, a webinar on that later this month. So I give her credit and kudos in that area. Encourage you to catch her presentation if that's your world that is out there. So let's have at it, ladies and gentlemen. Notice there is the opportunity for you to ask questions. I'll try to answer them on the fly as we go along rather than waiting until later. If the questions are too far afield, no pun intended, we'll cover those later, all right? So what is government property? We need to operationalize our definitions. Simply put, all property owned or leased by the government. So we see two issues there. Owned, which relates to title. Leased by is a different construct where the government goes out and leases property. Not the contractor leasing property, but rather the government leasing property and then providing it to the contractor. And then it subdivides that into those terms that we hear all the time: government furnished property and contractor acquired property. I regrettably hear people talk all the time about GFP and never cover contractor acquired property. Well, it's the same thing. No, it's not. No, it's not. We need to subdivide those quite clearly, because in some instances they allow different means of use and control and disposition and a variety of different things. So we see two subdivisions of government property. We hear all the time GFP. We hear some of the time CAP, contractor acquired property. Well, what does this mean? Well, first off, property in the possession of or acquired by the government, and then subsequently furnished to the contractor for use in performing. Good. The government has it first and then furnishes that. There is clarification. Well, there are a couple points of clarification within the clause. Government furnished property includes, but is not limited to, spares and property furnished for repair, maintenance, overhaul. So a little bit of clarification there. There are things that could fall under this scenario. There's another point, and I labeled that one in red within the definition. The next item, in my opinion, is a distractor, because it says government furnished property may also include contractor acquired property if the CAP is a deliverable, and it rambles on, and it's like, wait a minute, let's stick with one thing that could have been included elsewhere, but not an explanation under a definition. So it's there. We need to be aware of that, because there are very specific protocols for the conversion of CAP to convert that into GFP. We'll cover that a little bit later. CAP, well, that is stuff that the contractor acquired and to which the government has title. Now, I didn't like that term really, but there are certain things that in the FAR rewrite couldn't be changed. I would have rather that have been called contractor acquired government property. In this way, we would have had greater specificity that it was titled in the government. But leaving it as contractor acquired, if I wasn't intimate with what I'm doing in the world of government property, well, that's stuff I bought, so it's contractor property. Well, no, not in accordance with the definition that is contained in FAR Part 45, but also contained within the government property clause. So if we were to create a visual representation here, we could break this down into origins of government property, where it comes from, and then classifications. So its origin either has to be GFP or CAP, one of the two. Its classifications, though: material, equipment, special test equipment, and special tooling. All of these have very specific definitions. Now, you'll notice real property is sort of pushed to the side there and a little bit lower. Real property has a very lengthy definition, which we can't get into in this session, primarily driven by GSA and its definition. And we don't really furnish real property to defense contractors. We may allow them to utilize real property, but I've never figured out how to pick up buildings and move them over for the contractor to use, while all these other classes of property, material, equipment, SD and ST, those things are transportable in a majority of situations there. I didn't go through the specific definitions, but you should, because each classification of property has separate criteria that determines whether something is or is not one of the four classifications that we're looking at here, excluding real property. We won't talk about that. How do I know whether it's material or equipment or ST or ST? We'd have to look at its intended use to help us in that area. You need to dig deeper in that. But I also wanted to restrict or to set parameters on this, that some people are confused sometimes as to what is government property versus what is not government property. And fortunately, the FAR, in a very base location, 45.000, says this section 45, FAR Part 45, does not apply to property under statutory leasing. That's a whole separate issue. Let's talk about the more frequent occurrences where the government has acquired a lien or title because of advance payments, partial payments, progress payments, performance-based payments. These are really a form of financing, and you need to read these clauses and know they use the word title. They don't link to the government property clause. In fact, their property management requirements are under the instant clause for progress payments, 52-232-16, or performance-based payments, 52-232-32. Those have their own separate title provisions. It doesn't include disposal of real property. GSA would sort of get angry about that. Software. Software is always one of those issues that comes up. Well, we bought some software as a government property. Well, be careful, because software takes on its own life, whether it's through a license or whether it's treated as a deliverable, whether the government has full or unlimited rights to that data, which is where we generally see. And internal to the government, there are concerns with internal use software by various policy issues, one of which is created by DOD. One of our members, Ms. Amber Propert, deals with software and intellectual property from an internal use perspective, and I'll talk about one of her other instructions that she put out. This last one has caused some grief. Government property that is incidental to place of performance. Okay, a couple different things are embedded within that requirement there. Contractor personnel to be located on a government site or installation, right? Used within that location, and then we're given some examples there. All right, office furniture, desks, chairs, telephones. Things that we think would remain in that instant location in that government installation. But of course, people always bring up the aberrant, the deviant. Well, I carried this computer out traveling with me. Now, okay, well, we have to deal with some different stuff. I'm going to look at this in a little bit more detail just a little bit later, so we'll get there with that. So let me talk about the contractual requirements for providing government property. And I'm going to look at this from a backstory first. You know, when you read books and novels many times, or TV shows, they'll give you the backstory as to what happened before. So does it exist to provide? Who's involved? People like program managers, contracting officers, accountable property officers. Look at the policy on providing, some examples that are provided, some lists of GFP, and the clauses. So when we talk about the backstory, that government property that was intended to be furnished, does it actually exist? And I have to look at who's involved in that decision. Well, certainly the government program manager. Now, there was a great document for program managers for DOD, and there was a section in there that said, hey, look, program managers, It's your job to deal with that from an accountable property standpoint. Wow, that was so cool. And then they changed the reg and took it out. I have nowhere now to point that program manager to say that it was his or her responsibility unless I go deeper into other internal government regs. Well, the contracting officer is going to be involved. He or she is going to have to be responsible to make sure that the contract is properly formulated using the uniform contract format, dealing with proper placement of clauses and lists. And we have different types of contracting officers. Generally, you're going to deal with either a PCO or an ACO, a procuring contracting officer, or an administrative contracting officer. Heaven forbid you don't want to deal with a termination contracting officer. That's when bad things happen to good people, when there are terminations. But they're all out there as well. If you've dealt with the termination, you'll become very good friends with the TCO. Internal to the government has to keep records of its government property. No, really, Doug? Well, yeah, up until 2007, with the rewrite of the government property clause, it said the contractor's records were the official government property records. Oh my goodness, no. The government couldn't relinquish its fiduciary responsibility. Thank goodness in the rewrite of the FAR, and I got to give kudos to Mr. Tom Ruckdashel, one of our senior statesmen in property management, for getting the changes made to the clauses and getting them through all of the internal hurdles within there. But that was one of the issues that required clarification. The government keeps the fiduciary records. The contractor keeps our stewardship records. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. And when I talk about look, I was a government employee for 40 years. My goodness. I still consider myself a government employee in many ways, but I would recommend you check out DODI 5064, which was written again by Ms. Amber Propert, and it tells internally to the government what records have to be maintained on that accountable property. If you haven't read it or downloaded it to your desktop references, you should do that. There's the link to help you. Guidance for the government side of the house, not the contractor yet. You're not really there yet. All right. So what's the policy on providing government property? Well, it's a great policy. It's pretty simple. Contractors are ordinarily required to furnish all property. That's my New York accent. Necessary to perform government contracts. Yep, that's the government's official policy. Ordinarily required. And my little statement there, I'm being slightly humorous. If life only were that simple. So the question would be, echoing Carl Sagan, how did these billions and billions of dollars worth of government property get out there into the possession of contractors? Somebody made a decision to either furnish that property or via a contract type that would allow a contractor to go out and acquire that property. So here's the continuation of that policy. And look what it says here. To be in the government's best interest, okay? That the overall benefit significantly outweighs the cost of administration and property disposal, ultimate property disposal. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. And my sarcastic comment on the slide is, okay, really? That providing the property does not substantially increase the government's assumption of risk. Okay. The government requirements cannot otherwise be met. Okay. Yeah, these are really nice statements. Of course, there is an exception down at the bottom in green if you're looking at this on the screen. All right, that's really cool. Property provided under contracts for repair. Well, if I need something fixed, don't I have to provide the contractor the actual property that's there? So very good, very good. Somebody asked a question about 5064 not include material. There are other guidance, other manuals that talk about material. Yeah, they use the term equipment, which includes ST, and equipment. Great question. That would be a better one for Amber to answer, and she could direct you to the material regs that are there. Now, this is a busy slide. I'm not going to read it. I just want you to note that the CO, and in this case the PCO, should be documenting their files as to why this is important, why this is necessary. And I know within the DFARS PGI, they gave them some alternatives. For purposes of economy, standardization, security, to expedite production based upon the scarcity of an item, maintain the industrial base, contract type. All right, all of these are issues, and I love this statement here. They use my type of words, supported by a general perfunctory discussion. That's not good enough. They want substance. They want meat. They're looking for the overall benefit, the government assumption of risk, and government requirements. Lots of really, really good stuff there in that regard. So things to be on the lookout there in that. Lots of stuff for the contracting officer and program manager to think about. So we encourage you, take a look at some of these. Dig deeper into the basics that are there. I also need to talk about lists of GFP. So in many cases, I know all of you are going to say, okay, so the GFP just shows up. It arrived at our loading bay dock. Okay, that may not be the best way to do it. Real world, yep, sometimes that happens. But my answer is nope. Even before award, the government and the contractor should, in some instances, especially, they need to know what is to be furnished. Furnished. Now, I asked the question, why? Why do they need to know what needs to be furnished? If you're on the contractor's side of the house, well, quite clearly you need to think about how to cost and price out that contract. If the government promises to furnish you government property, it might affect your ultimate cost. And if the government doesn't succeed in furnishing that property, that also might affect your costs, right? While under a cost reimbursement type contract, yes, the government's going to pay you for those items in accordance with FAR Part 31 that are reasonable, allocable, and allowable. But wait a minute, if it's GFP, you really need to know what's in the contract. So from my perspective, the real world perspective, both parties should, in most cases, really most cases, must know what GFP is to be provided under a contract, right? We have no reason not to do that. And if you look at the policy statements again in the FAR, quite clearly the government says to the contracting officer that they shall insert a listing, shall insert a listing, not may, not if they don't feel like it, not if they're in a good mood that day. It's a mandatory statement with the word shall being a command. And included in that listing are bits of data: name, part number, description, manufacturer, model number, national stock number, quantity, unit acquisition cost, unique item identifier. Okay. Contractors, remember, you need to establish stewardship records. These are the types of bits of data that need to be on your stewardship records that the government should be providing, that the government should be furnishing for every item of government furnished property, right? And I have one down at the bottom that I'd ask you to be really, really careful about. I'm seeing more and more instances where the government has their listings provided and everything is checked in as is condition. Means that the government makes no warranties as this condition, and if it doesn't work, that is your problem as a contractor for any type of repair or replacement of those items. So be careful. Be careful that on those GFP lists that as is box is not marked there. So lots of good stuff. Now, I know I'm being parochial here. I'm looking at the DFARS. the DFARS. Now, if you're coming out of another agency, we talk about agency supplementation, and that's allowed by NASA. NASA has its FAR supplement. Department of Energy has its, and I always have to use this bit of humorous point. So everybody has their supplement. DOD has the DFARS. NASA has the NASA FAR supplement, the NFS. Department of Energy, DOE, has its supplement, the DEERS. I know it's a dad joke. Doe has the deers, all right, but I thought I'd give you something to fawn over. All right, so all of these are issues dealing with from a DoD specific requirement, and I've tried to help you out here by giving you a couple websites. One of which, if you're not aware of, from a fundamental standpoint, you need to go to this website, DoDProcurementToolbox.com. Yes, it's a .com site so that everybody can gain access to it without going through multiple firewalls. The beauty of it is that it's coming out of DoD, and a number of DoD personnel are responsible for it. So encourage you to look through what DoD says as one of the agencies out there. But I wanted to point out something where it is bi-directional. That when we look at this policy under 45.201, it describes what a contracting officer needs to do. It says that the CO shall require all offerers, now this is before contract award, to submit a list or description of the property that the offerer wants to use on a rent-free basis. Don't wait until after contract award and come in and ask, Mother, may I? In your proposal, submit to the government this required list. You need to tell them when you're going to use that, and potentially, especially under the fixed price world, not under cost reimbursement, but fixed price, if there's rental that would otherwise be charged for the use of this property. Now, the reason for that is so that the government could eliminate any competitive advantage that may go to one activity because they have the government property versus another activity that doesn't, another contractor that doesn't, to level the playing field, right? An important issue that the government does not give a competitive advantage to any one contractor. Now, the last bullet has always intrigued me. A description of the offerer's property management system. I've never been sure whether that is, they want all of our procedures or whether that is going to be a top level 30,000 foot view of what we do. Is our system approved? We've gone through numerous PMSAs with whatever agency, DCMA mostly. We have plans in place. We have voluntary consensus standards from ASTM that we're using. But I've always viewed that as a document from a 30,000 foot level. I've also worried that if you send in your entire property management system with, if you're a large contractor, could be multiple 3-ring binders printed out, they're just going to file it away and never look at it. I believe this is a marketing effort to say, hey, look, we know what we're doing. We've done it in the past. We've tried to do good stuff in managing government property. So some things that we need to look at there. So clauses. When we talk about clauses, it's always very interesting, the answers that I hear. And one of the comments that I'm hearing lately is, oh, just put them all in there. Wait a minute. What? And the answer is, well, they're self-deleting if they're not applicable. I'm sorry. No, you are now hearing me scream because I don't have any evidence to support that statement that they're self-deleting. Listen to me. Make sure in your review that the proper clauses are used and they're not just throwing in clauses that conflict with each other, okay? Something to be aware of, all right, in regard to that. So let's talk about the primary government property clauses that we see. I've lumped -1 and -9 together as the top one. -2 is an optional one there. And let me walk you through how these come to apply. We see the statement here that the contracting officer shall insert the clause. Shall, imperative. And I can break this down into a little bit more detail here, all right? So contracting officer shall insert the clause -1, all cost reimbursement type contracts, all time and material solicitation and contracts. So that's our first framework there. Cost reimbursement, time and material, got to use -1. If it's a labor hour solicitation, then we're only going to put in -1 if government property is to be furnished, if GFP is to be furnished. Other than that, all the government's paying for is labor hours, not any costs for property. The second part, using -1, fixed price solicitations and contracts when the government will provide government property. Step number 1, GFP. If there is GFP under that fixed price solicitation and contract, definitely I want to see the clause there. But if we're going to put in a cost reimbursement line item under that fixed price solicitation and contract, what is referred to as a hybrid contract, then -1 needs to be in there as well. Now, there is this exception under FAR Part 12 that deals with commercial contracts. I was going to say competitive. Commercial contracts, right? And if that government property exceeds the simplified acquisition threshold, and if you're not familiar with that, that's that $250,000 threshold that I referenced on the previous clause. If there's $250,000 of GFP, then you need the clause. Or if that contractor under that commercial contract is directed to acquire property. Now, from a philosophical standpoint and a pragmatic standpoint, if this is a commercial contract, the situations where I'd furnish GFP or allow a contractor to go out CAP would be the deviation, the aberration, the out of the ordinary, because it's a commercial contract. Why should I worry about it? I have seen it happen, all right? -9, this is a no-brainer. If you have -1 in your contract, you need to have -9. -9 and -1 are symbiotic. They go together, all right? So if you see -1, you better see -9. Otherwise, somebody slipped up. -2 is a weird clause, and I have to say I heavily influenced its writing based upon some of my experiences. But it says, look, you can use the -2 if it's for a fixed price service contract to be performed on a government installation with GFP that will be provided for initial provisioning only, and the government is not responsible for repair or replacement. Notice there are 6 criteria embedded within that one sentence. This is not just an ordinary run-of-the-mill clause. It's a clause that is very, very specifically directed at its use, at its application. So I urge you to take extreme caution when looking for that, clause. And of course, as I said, every agency is allowed to supplement. And I just picked out my frame of reference. DOD, you should be looking at the DFARS clauses. They're found in a equivalent section in the DFARS. Notice FAR clauses are 52.245. Here, the DFARS, because of the way it's structured in the CFR, is 252.245. And then we have the tag of a 4-digit number, 7001 through 7004. Tagging, labeling, marking of government furnished property, report of loss of government property, contractor property management system admin, reporting reutilization, and sort of an aberrant one that sticks out is out of place, 252.211-7007. The reason it was in 211 was because in its original iteration, it had a lot to do with the unique item identification requirements. It has subsequently morphed changed to become more focused on the reporting of GFP for its receipt within your system. So look at that. It's simple. If you're working under a DoD contract and you have the -1 FAR clause, FAR government property clause, then you need to have all of these 5 other clauses coming out of the DFARs in your contract. So when you're doing your initial contract review, whether on the government side or industry side, look for these clauses. Make sure they're there, all right? So something to consider there. Now, I do have to give you a warning that these clauses are in the process of being rewritten. The folks up at the Office of Undersecretary or Secretary of Defense, wonderful people who have lectured for NPMA a number of times. They are working on those. So any day, God knows when we'll see them posted in the Federal Register. But when they are, it's your obligation, it's your requirement, it's necessary that you comment on those. So please keep your eyes and ears open from them, either through NPMA with its legislative knowledge there and reporting of changes, though it's not a legislative issue, it's a Federal Register issue, or if you're in a trade group, a trade association, they also should be letting you know there. Now, look, all I did was list a bunch of government property clauses. There are a whole bunch of other clauses that you need to be aware of if you're the consummate property professional. And I've tried to list a few of them here. Things like the allowable cost and payment clause has a direct relationship with government property. The issue of audit of records for a sealed bid and negotiation has a direct impact on government property. The material management accounting system, because it involves CAP, has a direct involvement with government property. The contractor business systems, heaven forbid that your system is inadequate. The rules might kick in under that one. If you're dealing with aircraft, there's a real interesting clause called the ground and flight risk clause. There was a new iteration proposed that it was out for comment in the Federal Register. A lot of people are not that happy with that new clause, but take a look at it. Check a few of them. Now there are a lot of other clauses. I just listed 5, 6 of them just to pique your interest, but I would recommend you look at them. Look at them from a functional, from a fundamental issue there. So, great. So I'm going to get a little bit sarcastic here, and you'll have to forgive me. Those of you who know me, I sometimes wax poetic, right? But here I'm being sarcastic. So it's great that we know the clauses, and I don't mean to sound patronizing. Government industry, you are supposed to read them, read the contract, read what's in that contract to determine what you need to know and do. You are supposed to read the clauses too. So my sarcastic comment is, yep, something we do every time, right? Do your contracts people read that contract every single time? Do your property people read that contract every single time? They're supposed to, right? You are supposed to know what they mean. Wait, even for that government property stuff? Yeah, even for that government property stuff, you really need to know what it says there. So I need to digress and deal with a technical issue that exists out there. What happens if they left the clauses out? Well, let me deal with only one. -1, 52245-1, the fundamental property clause. What Dr. John Wyatt, who teaches a class out at Cal Poly, calls the super government property clause. Does the Christian doctrine apply? Now, what does the Christian doctrine say? Well, if a clause is fundamental procurement policy, we find that it's in the contract by operation of law. So if they leave the government property clause out of the contract, is it still in there? In my opinion, yes. We have an old court case which talked about the Asper-Dar government property clause, but I think the intent is the same. Government property and its management and control is fundamental procurement policy. So the courts would probably rule that the clause is in there by operation of law, regardless of whether it is. Now, here's my worry. Here's my advice to you. Please don't wait for this to go to the courts. If you see that the clause is not there, act and tell. If you're on the contractor side, tell your contracts people, hey, we got a technical error. If you're on the government side, Report that as a technical error through your automated systems if you're under DCMA. Don't let it slip under the radar, because the best laid plans of mice and men, oh, we'll just read it in there, and if something really goes wrong and we end up in court, oh my goodness, we can go on and on forever. So be careful about that. Be careful about that. So I'd like to look at the clause itself. I have a little bit more time. I got about 21 minutes here. I'd like to talk about the causal requirements, the specifics, and the processes, right? There's the clause, ladies and gentlemen. Paragraph A through paragraph M, covering a variety of different topics. What the contractor is contractually required to do, not how they are to do it, not how they're to perform that work, rather the outcomes that the government is looking for. So when we look at definitions, you got to know what the definitions, what the voids mean. Now, in my philosophy classes in college, both undergraduate and graduate, the defining of words to make a philosophical argument was critical. You got to know what those definitions are, how they apply, what they mean. When we look at paragraph B, it gives us a very broad generic language that we want contractors to have a property management system. It broadly addresses the contractor's responsibilities. It talks about the flow down of the requirements to their subs, not the clause verbatim unless there are changes, right? But the requirements, because subs could misinterpret what they mean if it was left intact. There's a new requirement for self-assessment that came into the 2007 clause. If we look at paragraph C, it authorizes use of that government property on the instant contract under which it was furnished or acquired, but then it may be allowed for authorized use on other contracts if authorized by the contract, embedded within that, written into it, or by the CO through later authorizations, which could be formalized through contract mods, right? Government furnished property, it talks about the warranties of timely delivery, suitability of use, and that warning about as is property. So check your GFP lists there, because if the government doesn't meet timely delivery and suitability for use, contractors, you may be entitled to an equitable adjustment that kicks in and helps you there, right? Let's see, there was a question posed, where are the specific contractual requirements for an acceptable self-assessment program found? There are none. It just says you need to have one. So your determination as to what you're going to provide based upon the type of work you do, I'm sorry, but you're going to have to determine that. And let me refer you to another presentation that Tom Ruckdashel and I did, which had applicability to subcontractor control, but I think you could use that in regard to self-assessments, that these have to be tailored to what you're doing, what your operations are. Little mom and pop shop, their self-assessment radically different than a major defense contractor doing self-assessment. So would I use maybe the DCMA model of a risk-based assessment? Sure, why not? Could we use some of the criteria that are established under their programs? Sure, why not? All right, I would steal from the best and brightest, but no, the government does not tell you how you have to do that. So that's a really important distinction. So good question, great question, right? When we talk about title to government property from a very broad perspective, they're going to talk about title to GFP. Well, that's sort of simple. If it's government furnished, the government always has title. We could talk about other government property under fixed price contracts, and that alludes to contractor acquired, and in theory there shouldn't be under a fixed price contract unless it was one of those aforementioned hybrid contracts where there are cost reimbursement line items under that fixed price contract. Government property under cost reimbursement, most definitely you want to be looking at what your disclosure statement says if you're a cost accounting standards covered contractor, as to how you're going to charge material and ST and what the clause says about title that we looked at before. And be careful again which clause you look at, because the title provisions under the progress payments clause, though it uses the word title, are different than the requirements under the government property clause. So make sure that whoever you're dealing with tells you specifically which clause you're dealing with. Contractor plans and systems, well, I'm going to show that on the next slide. So I like this, and I think it could have been done. We could have smushed some of this together, but because in my opinion, paragraph B and paragraph F are inexorably linked, because one says you need to have the system, paragraph B, then paragraph F says we're going to have to do this, though they never use these words, this life cycle approach. But since you're on an NPMA seminar, if you look at any of the NPMA literature, it has been following this life cycle approach for more than 40 years, all right? Addressing it as a cradle or birth to grave and death. Those words are very emotion laden, but I'm trying to get the idea from acquisition through disposition and contract closeout. So this is really cool, because when we look at paragraph F, we have to ask the question, are there 10 outcomes, 15 outcomes? Do we follow the DCMA approach where there are 22 outcomes? Or if you read my text on PMSA, there are 36 outcomes. It really has to do with how you define your populations for system analysis purposes. System analysis. So I've broken them out: acquisition, receiving, but under receiving, we're split into receipt and identification, records, physical inventory, subcontract control reports, relief of stewardship responsibility, contract closeout. Oh, I got to start from the bottom. I sort of wanted to make it a circle there. Under utilization, use, consume, move, store, maintain, disposition, contract closeout. So here we see that under certain headings like utilization, we have 4 items. Under receipt, we have 2 items, right? Under contract closeout, we have 2 items. So you could probably cull out 15 and even throw in things like property management as an overarching concern for procedures and application, right? So you need to be aware of those things, right? That you need to look at. So moving right along, if we look at that, then the government's going to come in. This is where the government has some options to come in and do a system analysis. They have access to your premises at all reasonable times. I don't think we should be looking for government PAs to come in at Saturday morning at 3 a.m. I know I, as a government PA, would probably be sound asleep in bed on a Saturday morning at 3 a.m. Sorry, ain't going to do that. I think we could find good business practice, normal work hours when contractors' managerial personnel are there. So I would be careful with that. You're going to be audited for the most part. Many of you are going to be under DCMA, all right? And I had to put this in there. I actually call that an audit, not a property management system analysis, but property management system audit, but with a small a, because I have some dear friends who are auditors, and in their environment, they use a capital A to distinguish them from us lowly peons who do audits in property. And I'm being a little bit hyperbole there, and it's just to have some fun with my friends. Liability. We could spend a whole day addressing liability. It is my favorite topic. But within the body of the clause and as an alternate, we have 2 different breakdowns. The limited risk of loss is in the body of the clause because that's the one that's used most frequently. Prior to 2007, the limited was an alternate. Well, we wanted to make it easier for contracting officers to use the correct iteration. So the full risk of loss we made as the alternate because that one is used less in our contracting community. I can't explain all the stuff on liability, but here's the deal. Great article came out in 2020 in the NPMA Journal. Tom Ruckdashel, one of my great friends, one of my great peers in property management, and I were talking about liability one day, and he says, "Hey, Doug, we should write an article," and it is out there. There's the link for the NPMA journal. There's an older version of an article from 2008, which was published after the FAR rewrite. So those are two articles, great articles that you could look at, and I encourage you, download them, sit down, read them. If you do corporate meetings, to have a discussion of them, lots of good stuff. And I'm looking at the time, and I got to keep moving along here. So if we look at that equitable adjustment, so those guarantees, the warranties that we make about suitability for use, relief of responsibility, all right, delay in delivery. It says within the clause that equitable adjustment is your only remedy. The government's not liable to suit for breach. Okay, in my years of doing this, I have been called up short on that by some of my contracting friends. And he says, "Doug, you're wrong. You're wrong, because the disputes clause is allowed by law, and you can't take away a legal option by putting other words into the clause." So mea culpa, ladies and gentlemen, really interesting. You'd have to read the disputes clause in concert with the government property clause. Now, that's a little bit of an advanced topic that we should look at later, but something for you to think about. The term contractor inventory disposal. Contractor inventory, go back to your definitions under the government property clause. It's a rather broad term that covers GFP, CAP, even termination inventory, that is excess to contractor needs. Interesting use of the words there, because again, it's confusing. Well, if it's contractor inventory, it's their stuff. Well, the people who wrote the rule, who wrote really the law, might not have been of our ilk and used a term that they were comfortable with. Excuse me, just 1 minute. So we need to look at that. Within paragraph J, talks about inventory disposal schedule requirements. The amplified requirements are on the DFARS, and within that, it references the constructs in that DFARS clause of PIEE, the Procurement Integrated Enterprise, and I never know whether it's pronounced PIE, all right? Okay, that was meant to be humorous too. Talks about the GFP module and all of that good stuff there. Talks about corrections, adjustments, storage, and disposition instructions. Notice how critical it is to read the clause. To read the clause, right? Can the government abandon government property? Well, the answer is yes, it can, but except, and my famous phrase, it depends. Now, if it's non-sensitive property after going through screening, yes, the government's allowed to abandon that by the terms and conditions of the contract. But if it's sensitive property or termination inventory, no, the government may not be allowed to do it unless, but except if the contractor gives their consent. That maybe there might be some other application for it. I don't want to say use, because if there was a use under a government contract, then I probably want to see that stuff transferred. All right. Within the clause, two little tidbits here, which are important that you should remember. Paragraph L, communications. Put it in writing. Everything should be in writing, because if it's not in writing, it didn't happen. Contracting officer on the government side might tell you to do something, but if it's not in writing and that contracting officer switched to another location or retires even, what proof do you have that you were given that direction, right? Everything should be in writing. And the trick is, if it's not in writing, follow it up with an email documenting your conversation. In accordance with the conversation today, you said for us to do the following. If we misinterpreted this or we're doing this wrong, please let us know. All right, put it in writing to protect yourself from a contractual standpoint. Overseas contracts, we just changed some words to include U.S. government property there. All right. Going on then, what does it mean in terms of your property management system? So, well, the agency responsible for contract admin is going to conduct an analysis of the contractor's property management system, the PMS, looking at the procedures, the policies, the practices of the system, right? And they're going to do that as frequently as conditions warrant and in accordance with the agency procedures, all right? And there's a lot more information out there, lots of manuals, lots of guides, all right? I want to emphasize this. Make sure you do not confuse government responsibilities with contractor contractual requirements. You need to differentiate what items apply to the contract or contractor versus directed at the government as internal government manuals. Be very careful about that situation, all right? Sometimes I've been hearing people say, well, you need to follow this because of this instruction or because of this manual that was not incorporated into the contract. All right. System analysis. Yep, we are guaranteed access to the contractor's facility at all reasonable times, right? Not that 3 a.m. on a Saturday morning. Remember, that's the case. We're not going to be coming in like gangbusters. If there's some other concern, guys, property doesn't do that. Shouldn't be doing that. All right. But look at this little tidbit here at the end of that paragraph. This access includes all site locations, all subcontractor premises. But notice the middle statement, with the contractor's consent. With the contractor's consent. Why? Because there are elements of law that you need to be aware of, one of which is the construct of privity of contract. Privity of contract, that the government has no privity of contract with your subcontractors. The government goes tag to you, the prime. Prime, you have a relationship with your sub. And also the issue of records readily available to authorized government personnel and shall be appropriately safeguarded. And that's why we encourage you to keep your records using a pencil. You'll notice there's a pencil down in the corner. No, I'm kidding. That was meant as a joke. Most of you have automated systems. You want to be able to password protect those and ensure that changes are not made arbitrarily, randomly, where there's no audit history. The pencil was a joke. I just need to clarify that, lest somebody comes back and starts yelling at me, which has happened before. All right. And so we saw the government property clause requirements for contractor inventory disposal at paragraph J, but I want to go back all the way to the beginning. It really should have started before that, because we said the government program manager is to be thinking about disposal and the planning of this procurement. The government contracting officer is to be using that as one of their evaluative elements in terms of whether it's good or bad to furnish government property in the formation of their procurement. But my real world question to you, does this always happen? And the comment down there is, you tell me. And I think a majority of people would say, no, there is nothing in the contract about disposal or disposition. Rather, it all goes through the normal paragraph J requirements. I would disagree with that. If there is GFP that the program manager and the PCO, the procuring contracting officer, know they want back, put it into the contract. All right, something that they should do there. So really, we didn't look at FAR 45.6, and we didn't look at some of the other sections, but I wanted to look at this just for a second here. 45.6, direction to the government. Direction to the government under 45.6. Direction of the contractor, read the clause, but also understand what the government plant clearance officer, this would be a government employee who is warranted, has a certificate of appointment as a PLCO, what they are authorized to do versus not do. You need to know what they can and cannot do, right? So remember, we talked about agency supplementation. There's a DFARS clause. there's a DFARS clause with lots of stuff running around about that, using PCARs, using PIE, using the GFP module if you're under DOD. So, but there's lots of guidance as to how to do that within these links, inclusive of in the PGIs that you can reference. So guys, look, it's not just reading one clause, but as you read one clause, all of a sudden, it's like an onion that you're peeling. There's more and more and more that you need to look at. So I encourage you, dig deeply there. So that's important there. So that was my topical outline. What is the government property provided under a contract? What is not government property? The contractual requirements on the part of the government of providing property, the contractor requirements for managing government property in a very broad 10,000, 15, 20,000 foot overview, government responsibilities for oversight, liability, disposition. I had 1 hour to do all that stuff, so that's a lot to cover, but I got some brain teasers for you to take back to your groups in your office. So here they are. You can throw these out and have fun discussing them. What are you allowed to acquire as government property under a contract? You receive government property which has no contractual accountability. What do you got to do? You have requirements to establish and maintain records under 52-245-1 for government property. Are there any other record requirements that impact government property? If you lose some government property, are you liable? And my famous answer. You all should be shouting it out right now. It depends, all right? Subcontractor versus alternate locations. Are they both the same? Utilization of government property. Must you track actual use? It depends. Disposition of government property. The contracting officer says to just throw it out. I don't need it no more. Contractor, should you do that? I would be very concerned if you did, but I want to know why. So ladies and gentlemen, this is me. I'm Doug Goetz. I'm now a retired grandfather who's got a couple of great grandkids who I love dearly, who we have fun playing with. My grandson loves to eat. My granddaughter is a veritable reader of everything and anything she can get her hands on in second grade. We love our family. I'm trying to slow down, guys, but it ain't happening. So I'm always glad to try and share some of my knowledge that I've acquired over the past 40 years, working with some brilliant professionals out there. There's my email. Feel free to send me any emails or questions. Many of you already do. There's my phone number for my business line. I don't pick up all the time. Leave a message with your name and phone number, and I'll get back in touch with you. So, Kim, I'm sorry I ran 2 minutes over. I'm sorry. I apologize. I'm turning it back to you.
No problem, Doug. Thank you again so much for speaking today. I do have a quick few announcements to wrap us up. The first is our next webinar is scheduled for next week, Wednesday, March 23rd at 1 p.m. Eastern. Ms. Yvonne Batcher will be presenting on the essentials for successfully managing equipment at a university. You can still register for that webinar on our MPMA website under Asset Management Awareness Month page or through the links that have been in the news flash. Also happening this month, you should see some emails coming out about the 2022 member survey. We encourage everyone to take the survey and provide us your feedback. We will be randomly selecting winners at the end of the month for those who participated. Prizes include Amazon gift cards and one grand prize of a $100 MPMA voucher. And then we're also excited to announce that we're selling MPMA men's and women's polo shirts all month long, and the proceeds go to the foundation. They're $35 plus shipping and handling, and will get shipped directly to you at the end of the fundraiser, which is at the end of March. All the information I've talked about today is on our Asset Management Awareness Month page. And then one last plug, if you want to see Doug in person, you can go to our 2022 Spring Education Seminar in Cincinnati, Ohio, April 5th and 6th. There's still time to register, so head over to the MPMA website and book your spot. Again, thanks for hanging on with us a few minutes extra. I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Doug, thanks again, and we will catch you next time.